need for evangelism today is intercultural evangelistic laborers, both across the street and across the world. We had David Garrison on talking about unreached people groups and gateway cities, and talk about the people that are in our neighborhoods right now. And you've even written about this, the stranger next door.
Stranger next door, yeah.
Yeah. How do we cross those barriers, and why is that such a need today?
Well, I think part of the how we cross those barriers is we just have to be intentional and do it. Oftentimes, we're not even intentional in sharing the gospel with people that look like us, smell like us, sound like us, and oftentimes, we don't even seek to prayerfully, engage people with the good news. How much more so am I usually, not being intentional in trying to engage those that are in my neighborhood that don't look like me, smell like me, sound like me, talk like me, walk like me. So I think part of the how is just we have to go and just do it and be humble, be a learner, be a friend, in connecting with people. The important aspect of your question is that we presently reside, in a world whereby there are unreached peoples that live around us. And it's not just the unreached peoples living somewhere in a remote jungle somewhere. They're living in our community, in our city, down the street. In other words, the cultural gap, to kind of go back to what I was saying a moment ago, the cultural gap between me as a follower of Christ and who I am and my cultural preferences and who they are is a very large gap. Maybe that gap is because of just where we live. Maybe the gap is because of socioeconomic issues. Maybe the gap is because of language differences. I mean, there are a variety of different things, and other things even out there as well. But if believers are not willing to cross those cultural gaps, to connect with people, to share the love of Christ with people, then they're not going to hear the gospel. They're not going to come to faith. They're not going to become a part of they're not going to become fruit-bearing disciples in Christ's local expressions of his universal body. And that is true whether you're talking about Christians in Indonesia crossing cultural gaps to reach their neighbors that are Muslim, to Christians living in Birmingham, Alabama, crossing those cultural gaps to reach those that are culturally distant from them as well.
One of the other things that you wrote about this, and I love the fact you're talking about being intentional and crossing those gaps, but you mentioned this: globalization and migration have also revealed the flaws of such thinking. The United States is home to the third largest number of unreached people groups in the world. Canada is home to the sixth largest number. Apostolic laborers are necessary to reach many of these groups in North America, as would be the case in their countries of birth. Throughout the world, the lines are now being blurred between foreign and domestic. I feel that every day. However, the church continues to allow geography rather than cultural context to define and limit the Great Commission labors. It's my contention that the cultural context is greater than the geography. How do we change people's minds on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to just doing right biblical teaching and helping people to think, what does it mean to take the gospel to those that are unreached? If you look, for example, in the New Testament, from Jerusalem to Antioch, that's about 300 miles. No one crossed any seas, no one crossed any oceans to get there. You could just, head north out of Jerusalem. And yet some unnamed men in Acts chapter 11, fleeing persecution that broke out after Stephen's martyrdom, they take the gospel, crossing cultural gaps to the Greek-speaking Gentiles. And so we have to help people think in terms that the Great Commission is not domestic and foreign. It's not North American and international. It's not home and abroad. It never has been. That's a cultural manifestation. And I think it goes back to a distortion of biblical truth. I think it goes back to a practical misapplication of pastoral ministry. And it's caused us to still, even to this day, think in terms of overseas as where that Great Commission work happens. However, migration has been happening since Genesis chapter 3, since the Exodus from the garden. But for the most part, the 20th century and the 21st century, they were called the age of migration because of the waves of people that are migrating here, there, and everywhere, not just to the West, but all over the world, because of the shrinking of the world, so to speak, from globalization, rapid transportation and instant communication, things of that nature, and the migration of people, not just refugees, but people who are migrating for a variety of reasons. That has really forced the church to really begin to think about this concept of, well, maybe it's not about overseas. Maybe this concept, maybe what we've been calling missions for some time, again, I would say not a biblical term, but maybe this concept, maybe it's not about home and abroad. And the whole concept of the diasporas of the nations moving around, that's really been shaking a lot of people in their thinking and their imagination at this point in time. And I think that is a good thing.
Well, this idea of, you even mentioned one of those subjects that haven't been really studied well yet is diaspora missiology, because of that. But I don't want to get too technical for our folks. It's just that God's moving the world all around us. But yet you mentioned in the book that you cite Barrett and Johnson, my friend Todd, and the World Christian Trends piece they wrote, that a lot of our finances, and I know Nick had actually mentioned this when he was on the show, 95% of our finances are spent within kingdom related things here, meaning that the structures that we already have, which leaves only 5% for this group. Now, I don't want to get the term wrong because you've cited it, and we're going to get to this in a minute, where you talk about the proper terminology. So give me a term rather than missions. That unreached people groups, is that a better way of describing it? You said not a biblical term for missions. What term should I give? Or apostolic imagination? Should I use that?
Yeah, well, apostolic imagination, unreached people groups, those are not biblical terms either.
That's true.
So,
that's true.
So
the ethne. We'll use that. We can use
go
the
there.
ethne.
I mean, since the 1970s, the concept of unreached people groups, that terminology has been widely accepted among evangelicals, and so that still carries a lot of weight in explaining those groups that are less than 2% followers of Christ. So that's helpful. I mean, it has its limitations. I still use that terminology to talk about unreached peoples.